The Necessity of Money, How Hegel Helped Marx Surpass Ricardo's Theory of Value, by Patrick Murray. Marx's theory of value has long been confused with Ricardo's labor theory, and in the wake of Piero Sraffa's revival of Ricardian thought, we now discover a whole school of Marxist or post-Marxist economics operating on neo-Ricardian assumptions. Footnote. Or endnote, sorry, I gotta skip to the endnotes. I have treated topics of this chapter as well as related ones in my book, Marx's Theory of Scientific Knowledge, and the essay, Karl Marx as Historical Materialist, Historian of Political Economy, published in 1988, or both published in 1988. However, Marx's theory of value is cut from a different cloth than Ricardo's, a point to which Marx called attention in the very first chapter of Capital. There Marx emphasized the centrality and originality of his distinction between concrete and abstract labor, further characterized by the abstract labor that constitutes value as, quote, socially necessary, end quote, described value as a, quote, social substance, and a, quote, ghostly objectivity, and introduced a seminal yet seldom acknowledged innovation into political economy, the analysis of the value form. In this chapter, I hope to make plainer the dialectical logic of the value form as Marx presents it. To aid in this, I trace the history of Marx's engagement with Hegel's philosophy, his logic in particular, showing how Marx acquired the conceptual resources that enabled Marx to overcome Ricardo's theories of value and capital. Unless the distinctive logic operating Marx's theories of value and capital is appreciated, his unique achievements go unrecognized. Contrary to Joan Robinson's complaint that, quote, that smatterings of, quote, Hegelian stuff and nonsense, end quote, botch up capital, I argue that it is precisely the lessons learned from Hegel that make capital great. Marx's critical engagement with Hegel's logic, particularly his logics of essence and the concept, are both pure theories, and as Hegel put them into practice, notably in The Philosophy of Right, was an early and decisive element in his intellectual development. Hegel characterized the study of logic as, quote, the absolute education and breeding of consciousness, end quote. And Marx's was a, quote, well-bred, end quote, consciousness. Hegel pointed to the lack of this logical education as the chief shortcoming of scientific empiricism, quote, the fundamental illusion in scientific empiricism is always this, that scientific empiricism uses the metaphysical categories of matter, force, those of one, many, universality, also infinity, etc. Furthermore, it extends implications along the thread of such categories, whereby scientific empiricism presupposes and applies syllogistic forms, and in all this, scientific empiricism does not know that scientific empiricism itself carries on and contains metaphysics and uses those categories and those metaphysical categories' connections in a fully unconscious manner, end quote. Hegel. Marx has this, quote, fundamental illusion, end quote, in mind when, in a footnote to his treatment of the value form in the first edition of Capital, he levels against the economists just that complaint. Quote, it is hardly surprising that the economists, wholly under the influence of empirical, bracket, Stofflicher, and bracket, interests, have overlooked the content of the form of the relative expression of value, when before Hegel, professional logicians even overlooked the content of the form of the paradigms of judgment and syllogism, end quote. Marx and Engels. Marx. But it's in the Marx and Engels collected works. By concentrating on certain episodes in Marx's development of logically, quote, well-bred, end quote, consciousness, in the first part of the chapter, I seek to identify what Marx learned from Hegel, as well as the criticism Marx made of Hegel, in ways that will illuminate Marx's mature critique of political economy, which is the focus of the second part. I believe that Hegel's philosophy functioned as a heuristic guide as Marx worked out his critique of capitalism, a point best made by reference to the Paris manuscript critique of Hegel. Hegel surely aided Marx in understanding capitalism, but conceiving of Hegel as the logician of capital may not have made Marx a more accurate interpreter of Hegel. Footnote. The fact that Marx read Hegel so much in the light of various Hegelians, including amateurs like Zilliga and Proudhon, may have blurred his outlook on Hegel himself. End footnote. My purpose, however, is to explicate Marx's use of Hegel as Marx understood Hegel, not to judge this interpretation, since the Hegelian essence logic, whereby the essence necessarily appears as something other than the essence itself, is the pivotal conceptual resource funding Marx's theory of value. Value necessarily appears as something other than value self, namely money. It is the center of attention in much of what follows. I'm going to repeat that sentence because there is italics in it. Since the Hegelian essence logic, whereby the essence necessarily appears as something other than the essence itself, is the pivotal conceptual resource funding Marx's theory of value. Value necessarily appears as something other than itself, namely money, price, is a center of attention in much of what follows. New section, Marx's critique of philosophy. New section, the standard essence appearance model and the essence appearance model's Hegelian critique. The standard essence appearance model mistakes essence for a real but strangely unobservable thing hidden behind the curtain of appearances, and essence admits of no logical relationship between essence and appearance. Wikipedia says, essence has various meanings and uses for different thinkers and in different contexts. Essence is used in philosophy and theology as a designation for the property or set of properties or attributes that make an entity the entity it is, or expressed negatively, without which that entity would lose that entity's identity. Essence is contrasted with accident, which is a property or attribute the entity has accidentally or contingently, but upon which its identity does not depend. I guess I'll look up accident while I'm here too. An accident in metaphysics and philosophy is a property that the entity or substance has contingently, without which the substance can still retain its identity. An accident does not affect its essence, according to many philosophers. It does not mean a, quote, accident, as used in common speech, a chance incident, normally harmful. Examples of accidents are color, taste, movement, and stagnation. Accident is contrasted with essence, a designation for the property or set of properties that make an entity or substance what it fundamentally is, and which it has by necessity, and without which it loses its identity. Aristotle made a distinction between the essential and accidental properties of a thing. Thomas Aquinas and other Catholic theologians have employed the Aristotelian concepts of substance and accident in articulating the theology of the Eucharist, particularly the transubstantiation of bread and wine into body and blood. In modern philosophy, an accident, or accidental property, is the union of two concepts, property and contingency. Non-essentialism argues that every property is an accident, Modal necessitarianism argues that all properties are essential and no property is an accident. Appearance or phenomenon, or phenomenon redirected from appearance says, a phenomenon is an observable event. The term came in to its modern philosophical usage through Immanuel Kant, who contrasted phenomenon with the noumenon, which cannot be directly observed. Kant was heavily influenced by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in this part of Kant's philosophy, in which phenomenon and noumenon serve as the interrelated technical terms. Far predating this, the ancient Greek Pyrrhonist philosopher Sextus Empiricus also used phenomenon and noumenon as interrelated technical terms. Back to the text. The standard essence appearance model mistakes essence for a real but strangely unobservable thing hidden behind the curtains of appearance, and it admits of no logical relationship between essence and appearance. This is just the model operative in Ricardo's theory of value. Value is something real and independent, quote, embodied labor, end quote, secreted in commodities, and no thought is given to showing out any logical connection between value and value's appearance, price. In fact, these two features of the standard model amount to much the same thing. If the essence is reified, it stands alone, logically free of appearances. The relationship between essence and appearances is conceived on the model of two types of things. One, sensuously manifest yet dispensable, sensually manifest yet dispensable appearances, and the other, real yet unobservable, except to pure reason, essence. In this model of essence and appearance, science must be a one-way street. Externally, since there is no internal relation between independent entities, relating the appearance to their real basis in the world of essence. Just why this essence should have these appearances is never raised. A prime example of this thinking is provided by Descartes' analysis of the blob of wax in his Meditations. Wikipedia says, Meditations on First Philosophy, in which the existence of God and the immortality of the soul are demonstrated, often called simply the Meditations, is a philosophical treatise by René Descartes, first published in Latin in 1641. The French translation was published in 1647 as Meditations Métaphysiques. The title may contain a misreading by the printer, mistaking Anime Immortalitas for Anime Immaterialitas, as suspected by A. Baylet or Bayet. Meditations is made up of 6 meditations, in which Descartes first discards all belief in things that are not absolutely certain, and then tries to establish what can be known for sure. Descartes wrote the meditations as if he had meditated for 6 days. Each meditation refers to the last one as yesterday. In fact, Descartes began work on the meditations in 1639. One of the most influential philosophical texts ever written, Descartes' Meditations is widely read to this day. Descartes' Meditations consists of the presentation of Descartes' metaphysical system at its most detailed level, and in the expanding of his philosophical system, first introduced in the 4th part of his Discourse on Method, 1637. Descartes' metaphysical thought is also found in the Principles of Philosophy, 1644, which the author intended to be a philosophical guidebook. Back to the text. After wondering how we know a bit of wax to be the same thing after all the bit of wax's sensuous appearances have been altered, Descartes concludes, quote, "The truth of the matter, perhaps, as I now suspect, is that this wax was neither the sweetness of honey, nor that pleasant odor of flowers, nor that whiteness, nor that shape, nor that sound, but only a body which a little while ago appeared to my senses under these forms, and which now makes itself felt under others." End quote. Descartes. Descartes attributes the primary qualities extension, flexibility, duration, and movability to the body of the wax. In making this famous distinction between primary and secondary qualities, Descartes engages the standard model of essence and appearance that account for differing appearances by referring them to a common underlying essence. Wikipedia says, the primary-secondary quality distinction is a conceptual distinction in epistemology and metaphysics concerning the nature of reality. It was most explicitly articulated by John Locke in his essay concerning human understanding, but earlier thinkers such as Galileo and Descartes made similar distinctions. Primary qualities are thought to be properties of objects that are independent of any observer, such as solidity, extension, motion, number, and figure. These characteristics convey facts. They exist in the thing itself, can be determined with certainty, and do not rely on subjective judgments. For example, if an object is spherical, no one can reasonably argue that the object is triangular. Primary qualities, as mentioned earlier, exist outside of the observer. They adhere to an object in such a way that if the object was changed, e.g. divided, if the object is divisible, a sphere is not, since dividing a sphere would result in two non-spheres, the primary qualities would remain. When dividing a divisible object, quote, solidity, extension, figure, and mobility, end quote, would not be altered because the primary qualities are built into the object itself. Another key component of primary qualities is that they create ideas in our minds through experience. They represent the actual object. Because of this, primary qualities such as size, weight, solidity, motion, and so forth can all be measured in some form. Using an apple as an example, the shape and size can actually be measured and produce the idea in our minds of what the object is. A clear distinction to make is that qualities do not exist in the mind, rather they produce ideas in our minds and exist within the objects. In the case of primary qualities, they exist inside the actual body substance and create an idea in our mind that resembles the object. Secondary qualities are thought to be properties that produce sensations in observers, such as color, taste, smell, and sound. Secondary qualities can be described as the effect things have on certain people. Secondary qualities use the power of reflection in order to be perceived by our minds. These qualities, quote, would ordinarily be said to be only a power in rather than a quality of the object, end quote. They are sensible qualities that produce different ideas in our mind from the actual object. Going back to the example of the aforementioned apple, something such as the redness of the apple does not produce an image of the object itself, but rather the idea of red. Secondary qualities are used to classify similar ideas produced by an object. That is why when we see something, quote, red, it is only, quote, red in our minds because they produce the same idea as another object. So going back to the color of the apple, it produces an idea of red, which we classify and identify with other red ideas. Again, secondary qualities do not exist inside the mind. They are simply the powers that allow us to sense a certain object and thus, quote, reflect and classify similar ideas. According to the theory, primary qualities are measurable aspects of physical reality. Secondary qualities are subjective. Back to the text. In the Cartesian model, Hegel recognizes a classic case of Enlightenment reification and forgetfulness. Hegel objects that Descartes recast primary qualities into the logic of secondary qualities. That is, into the logic of immediacy, the logic of being. Hegel takes his clue from Descartes' own words, quote, "But what is here important to notice is that perception, bracket, or the action by which we perceive, end bracket, is not a vision, a touch, nor an imagination, and has never been that, even though it formerly appeared so, but is solely an inspection by the mind," end quote. Descartes. According to Descartes, perception is not a matter of sensuous imagination, but the activity of pure understanding. In one respect, Descartes' observations do not differ from Hegel's, for Hegel recognizes in Descartes' statement the admission that the distinction between essence and appearance, primary and secondary qualities, posits a distinction between two logics of thought, intuition and understanding. Descartes errs by reifying the concepts of the understanding, primary qualities, forcing them into the same mold as immediate intuitions or secondary qualities. Footnote. Descartes writes, quote, "But when I distinguish the real wax from its superficial appearances, and when, just as though I had removed its garments, I consider it all naked, ... end quote." End footnote. But primary qualities are, by Descartes' insistence, in principle non-observable, non-sensuous. Likewise, Descartes forgets that the concepts of the understanding arise only by abstracting from sensuous intuitions. In terms of Francis Bacon's witty metaphor, in thinking that he knows the wax solely by means of the understanding, Descartes the bee absentmindedly mistakes himself for a spider. Footnote. In aphorism XCV of the New Organon, Bacon writes, quote, "The men of experiment are like the ant. They only collect and use. The reasoners resemble spiders who make cobwebs out of their own substance. But the bee takes a middle course. It gathers its material from the flowers of the garden and of the field, but transforms and digests it by a power of its own," end quote. Bacon. New Organon. According to Wikipedia, Novum Organum is a philosophical work by Francis Bacon written in Latin and published in 1620. The title is a reference to Aristotle's work Organon, which was his treatise on logic and syllogism. In Novum Organum, Bacon details a new system of logic he believes to be superior to the old ways of syllogism. This is now known as the Baconian method. For Bacon, finding the essence of a thing was a simple process of reduction and the use of inductive reasoning. In finding the cause of a, quote, phenomenal nature, end quote, such as heat, one must list all the situations where heat is found. Then another list should be drawn up, listing situations that are similar to those of the first list except the lack of heat. A third table lists situations where heat can vary. The quote form nature, or the quote form nature, end quote, or cause of heat must be that which is common to all instances in the first table, is lacking from all instances of the second table, and varies by degree in instances of the third table. The title page of Novum Organum depicts a galleon passing between the mythical pillars of Hercules and stand either side of the Strait of Gibraltar, marking the exit from the well-charted waters of the Mediterranean into the Atlantic Ocean. The pillars, as the boundary of the Mediterranean, have been smashed through by Iberian sailors, opening a new world for exploration. Bacon hopes that empirical investigation will, similarly, smash the old scientific ideas and lead to greater understanding of the world and heavens. This title page is liberally copied from Andres Garcia Céspedes' Regimento de Navegación, published in 1606. The Latin tag across the bottom, multi per ensibunt and augipeter scientia, is taken from the Old Testament, Daniel 12:4. It means, quote, many will travel and knowledge will be increased, unquote. Back to the text and footnote. In this light, we see why Hegel writes that, quote, the essence must appear, end quote. Essence must show essence's self in something that is not immediately essence's self, precisely because essence has no immediate existence. It is not the logic of being. Essence must appear because essence is a being of reflection, and essence pertains to the logic of reflection that something be given for reflection, that something is appearance. How far, after all, would Descartes have gotten in knowing the wax without having sensed the wax? Footnote. Descartes states that imagination, taken here to include sensation, is non-essential to his thinking. Quote, I notice that this ability to imagine which I possess, insofar as it differs from the power of conceiving, is in no way necessary to my nature or essence, that is to say, to the essence of my mind, end quote. Descartes, end footnote. Under this dialectical conception of essence and appearance, science is no longer a one-way street that externally relates appearances to essence. It works both from the appearances to the essence and from the essence to the appearances. Footnote. I have no closing arguments for the notion of necessity operative here, but it is a fact of our language that non-causal claims of necessity are common. E.g., without property there can be no theft. A good deal of philosophical energy has been spent, notably by David Hume and Immanuel Kant, to account for these claims of necessity. The analytic-synthetic distinction put forward by Kant explains many such claims in terms of analyticity, that is, tautologies. Wikipedia says the analytic-synthetic distinction is a semantic distinction used primarily in philosophy to distinguish between propositions, in particular statements that are affirmative subject-predicate judgments, that are of two types, analytic propositions and synthetic propositions. Analytic propositions are true or not true solely by virtue of their meaning, whereas synthetic propositions' truth, if any, derives from how their meaning relates to the world. While the distinction was first posed by Immanuel Kant, the analytic-synthetic distinction was revised considerably over time, and different philosophers have used the terms in very different ways. Furthermore, some philosophers, starting with Willard Van Orman Quine, have suggested whether there is even a clear distinction to be made between propositions which are analytically true and propositions which are synthetically true. Debates regarding the nature and usefulness of the distinction continue to this day in contemporary philosophy of language. Back to the text. It took Kant most of a long, hard book to try to explain necessity of a non-tautological sort. It is fair to see in Hegel a forerunner of Quine in rejecting the analytic-synthetic distinction, and with it the nominalist effort to reduce all necessity to a matter of human conventions for the use of terms. Wikipedia says in metaphysics, nominalism is the view that universals and abstract objects do not actually exist other than being merely names or labels. There are two main versions of nominalism. One denies the existence of universals, that which can be instantiated or exemplified by many particular things, e.g., strength, humanity. The other version specifically denies the existence of abstract objects as such, objects that do not exist in space and time. Most nominalists have held that only physical particulars in space and time are real, and that universals exist only post-res, that is, subsequent to particular things. However, some versions of nominalism hold that some particulars are abstract entities, e.g., numbers, whilst others are concrete entities that do exist in space and time, e.g., pillars, snakes, and bananas. Nominalism is primarily a position on the problem of universals. Nominalism is opposed to realist philosophies such as Platonic realism, which assert that universals do exist over and above particulars, and in the hylomorphic substance theory of Aristotle, which asserts that universals are immanently real within them. However, the name, quote, nominalism emerged from debates in medieval philosophy with Rosellinus. The term nominalism stems from the Latin nomen, name. John Stuart Mill summarizes nominalism in his Apothegm. Quote, there is nothing general except names, end quote. In philosophy of law, nominalism finds its application in what is called constitutional nominalism. End footnote. Footnote. Wait, no. Back to the text. I'm still in the footnote, actually. Dialectical logic extends ordinary judgments about how concepts are connected without either the, quote, dogma of the analytic-synthetic distinction or any sweeping philosophical prohibitions against our ordinary attributions of necessity. End footnote. Footnote. Marx pursues this double meaning in his counts of value and capital in Capital. See the treatment of value in the second part of this chapter. End footnote. Appearances are no longer viewed as extraneous to essence. Hegel's dialectical conception of essence thus overcomes the one-sidedness of the standard view, which overlooks the nature of reflection. Essence for Hegel includes the complete logical figure, the appearances, which are appearances only by being reflected, and that which is reflected in them. It would be a terrible mistake to conclude from Hegel's statement, quote, "The essence must appear as something other than itself," end quote, that we should ignore the appearances precisely because they are not the essence. Rather, the appearances belong to the complete concept of the essence. Appearances and essences are interdependent. This is precisely the logic that must be understood in order to grasp what sets Marx's theory of value off from the Ricardian. Though he draws heavily on Hegel's criticism of conventional categories, Marx has a less optimistic understanding of the dialectic of essence than the one he attributes to Hegel. According to Marx, Hegel believes that the oppositions inherent in essence can be reconciled through the mediation of a third party. For example, the state can reconcile the antagonisms provoked by civil society. For Marx, however, the very opposition of essence and appearance needs to be uprooted, not mediated. The logic of essence poses irreconcilable conflicts rather than a necessary differentiation that pushes on to higher unity. Third parties such as heaven, the state, or money signal submerged conflict, not achieved harmony. Marx's perceived differences with Hegel regarding the logics of essence and the concept are best examined in the context of two early works, namely Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right and the essay on Hegel's philosophy among the Paris manuscripts. New section, the philosophy of right. In Hegel's political philosophy, the incarnation of mediation in the state is the law-making power. Where monarch and bureaucracy come into contact with the people, the atoms of civil society, to reconcile diverse and opposed interests, Marx assembles a host of empirical arguments against Hegel's theory of the law-making power as mediator, but we are after the logical implications of the discussion. Marx states them as follows, quote, "The rational relation, the syllogism, appears then to be complete. The law-making power, the middle term, is a mixtum compositum of both extremes. The sovereign principle in civil society, the empirical singularity and empirical universality, the subject and predicate. In general, Hegel conceives of the syllogism as mediator, as a mixtum compositum. One can say that in his development of the rational syllogism, the whole transcendence and mystical dualism of his system comes to the surface. The middle term is the wooden sword, the concealed opposition between universality and singularity." End quote. Marx. Here Marx traces the inadequacy of Hegel's conception of the law-making power back to a fundamental inadequacy in Hegel's logic of mediation, typified by the rational syllogism. The logic of the concept's promise of reconciliation proves an empty boast. Where the hell am I? The logic of the concept's promise of reconciliation proves an empty boast, a wooden sword. For Marx, Hegel's is a logic of accommodation. For Hegel's logic passes beyond a given level without revolutionizing that given level. The relation between civil society and the state is a case in point. Hegel's state transcends the inadequacy of civil society without transforming civil society's logical atom, the abstract egoistic individual. The contradictions of the political sphere result from not addressing the unreconciled contradictions of civil society. The contradictions of the political sphere result from not addressing the unreconciled contradictions of civil society. New section, the Paris Manuscript. The Paris Manuscript on Hegel pursues the theme that his philosophy provides a faulty reconciliation of particular and universal, of thought and nature. Hegel fails to escape the antinomies of the logic of essence as Marx construes it. Moreover, in this essay, Marx merges the logic of Hegel's philosophy with that of capitalist economic forms, thus anticipating the roles that his criticism of Hegel's logics of essence and the concept will play in Marx's Capital. Marx explicitly associates Hegel with classical political economy. Quote, Hegel shares the standpoint of the modern national economists. Hegel grasped labor as the essence of the self-confirming essence of man. Hegel sees only the positive side of labor, not labor's negative side. Labor is man's coming to be for himself within externalization, Entauserung, or as externalized man, end quote. Marx. The Paris Manuscripts. This passage is deceptive because as yet Marx lacks a differentiated use of the term labor. As it reads, Marx seems to say that labor is by nature both positive and negative, and that it always involves externalization. To interpret labor in that way would make Marx's critique of Hegel unintelligible. By labor, Marx means alienated labor, the specific social form of labor that exists under capitalism. Marx's remark, then, is no more a naive congratulation of Hegel for celebrating human self-creation in the phenomenology than is Marx's theory of value an uncritical echoing of Ricardo's. The barb is that Hegel captures the essence of humanity under the conditions of alienated abstract labor. The double character of capitalist society permeates both classical political economy and Hegel's philosophy. Both achieve undeniable scientific insights, but always, quote, within the framework of externalization, Entauserung, end quote. In Capital, Marx develops the dialectic of the value form to demonstrate the necessity by which value has an external expression that is not identical with value. That expression of value is money. In Hegel's philosophy, logic is the external expression of abstract thinking, the money of spirit. The appearance of logic as a sphere of logic's own is for Marx a necessary consequence of the activity of abstract (alienated) thought. Quote, the positive thing that Hegel achieved here in his speculative logic is to show that the determinate concepts, the universal, fixed thought forms in their independence over against nature and spirit, are a necessary result of the universal alienation of the human essence, hence also of human thinking. End quote. Marx. Hegel's system of absolute idealism demonstrates for Marx the necessary connection between abstract alienated thinking and a freestanding logic, just as Marx's later analysis of the value form demonstrates why, under the conditions of abstract alienated labor, value-producing labor, we need money. We can now see how Marx views the path of Hegel's system as a whole. The idea externalizes itself as nature and spirit, only to return to the idea's self as absolute in the end. The idea's story of externalization, Entauserungsgeschichte, parallels the dialectic by which money is transformed into capital. Money externalizes money's self in commodities, means of production and labor power, and returns to money's self with a surplus in the valorization process, Verwertungsprozess. The logical idea externalizes itself in nature and human spirit, but it recognizes nature and human spirit only as representations of itself. Quote, thus the whole of nature, and we could add, quote, spirit here, end bracket, only repeats for him, bracket, Hegel, end bracket, the logical abstractions in a sensuous external form, end quote. Marx. When money is transformed into capital, money is externalized into natural objects, labor power, and products of human labors on natural objects. In so doing, capital posits the earth and labor power, nature and human spirit as values. At the end of its valorization process, capital returns to the fixated abstraction of its starting point, money. To the eyes of capital, the earth and human labor are valueless in themselves, just as an absolute idealism scheme of things, quote, nature as nature, ... is senseless, end quote. Marx. By forgetting their sources, both the idea's course of externalization, which treads the logical path of the negation on a grand scale, and capital's cycle of negations, buying, producing, selling, in the process of valorization, condemn themselves to a hellish running in spirals. These last considerations set up an observation about capital to which we will return, namely, that Marx frames the logic of capital in terms of his own construal of Hegel's logic of the concept, according to which it fails to break free of the antinomies of the logic of essence. New section. The importance of Hegelian logic to Marx's early work. We now have the background to appreciate how decisive Marx's attention to Hegel's logic was for much of his early work. Already in his dissertation and associated notes, the logic plays an important role. Thus, Marx argues that Plato's transcendence, his creation of a world of ideas, the absolute paralleling the sensible world, stems from Plato's uncritical acceptance of the given. Moreover, this acquiescence leads Plato to create a mythology that uses given sense images as symbols and as myths for the absolute. Thus, an unreconciled dualism necessarily expresses itself in a third party, Plato's myths. As for the central figure of his dissertation, Marx construes the Epicurean declination of the atom, its swerving from the regular path, as the necessary manifestation of the defective principle of the free, subjective individual that Marx identifies as the essence of Epicurus's philosophy. On the Jewish question is an extraordinary example of Marx's logic of essence set to work. Heaven is the necessary expression of the unreconciled divisions within Christian society. The modern state is the necessary expression of the unreconciled contradictions of civil and political life. And money is the necessary expression of the antinomies of the capitalist economy. Marx's criticism of Feuerbach and of the young Hegelians' approach to religion generally is informed by his distinctive logic of essence. Feuerbach regarded religion as alienation precisely because it is the appearance of the human essence in something other than the human, namely the divine. Marx, however, criticizes Feuerbach for not seeing that alienation was the necessary result of the contradictory character of the human essence that is driven to religion. Quote, Feuerbach starts out from the fact of religious self-alienation, the doubling of the world into a religious world and a secular world. Feuerbach's labor consists therein to dissolve the religious world into the religious world's secular foundation. But the fact that the secular foundation lifts itself up from itself and fixes itself as an independent realm in the clouds is only to be explained out of the self-rupture and self-contradicting of this secular foundation. This bracket foundation must itself therefore be understood in its contradiction as well as be revolutionized in practice, end quote. Marx. It is the division among humans that necessarily give rise to religion. To eliminate the gods is not to eliminate those divisions. This insight, which encapsulates his logic of essence, set Marx off from the program of the young Hegelians. Attacking religion will not address the more fundamental problem of which religion is only a necessary expression. Analogously, Marx later rejects the Proudhonian analysis of the relationship between value and price, and consequently rejects Proudhonian and left-Ricardian socialism. Footnote: Hans-Georg Backhaus pursues this analogy in detail. End footnote. Let us take stock of Marx's thinking about the logic of essence. 1. An essence logic is in place in situations involving unreconciled dualisms, as for example between the private and social aspects of labor and capitalism. 2. The dualism involved in an essence logic is not only unreconciled, but unreconcilable until that dualism is overturned. Thus, Marx rejects Hegel's conception of the way the concept purports to reconcile the opposition inherited from essence. 3. The essence must appear as something other than itself, as for example, abstract labor (value) must appear as exchange value (money, price), and surplus value must appear as profit. 4. Because essence must appear as something other than essence's self, efforts to establish the identity of appearances with essence are necessarily one-sided. This point comes to play in Marx's criticism of Proudhonian, quote, time-chit proposals, and generally with regard to value-price issues. Appearances are indispensable to the essence. Appearances belong to the essence. Thus, a scientific account moves not just from appearance to essence, as does Ricardo in his theory of value, but from essence to appearance, as Marx does in his account of the value form. Even this kind of talk can be misleading, for the essence is really the whole logical figure. The appearance is and that which necessarily does not appear, quote, essence. And that's in italics, I'm going to read it again. Even this kind of talk can be misleading, for the essence is really the whole logical figure. The appearances and that which necessarily does not appear, essence. So I guess what I'm guessing that means is that the essence is the relationship between value and its appearance, not value itself. Is what I'm guessing would be the implication of that, right? Is that this kind of the idea that there's some radically dualistic separation between essence and appearance, at least in terms of money or value categories and their material sorry, I fucked that up. Essences and their material appearance, right? I don't know if I said that right. Basically, essence appearance are of a whole, even though they are distinct moments of that whole. Thus, value-producing labor and price belong to a logical whole. Here we are. 5. That the essence must appear as something other than the essence's self tells us the essence's defects. So, for example, the analysis of the value form reveals something defective about value. Thus, Marx consistently associates essence's, quote, logic of the third party, end quote, with religion and alienation. 6. As Tony Smith points out in his book, The Logic of Marx's Capital, quote, an individual moment within an essence structure is thoroughly subordinate to the essence lording over it, end quote. Essence logic is characterized by relations of domination by abstractions, a theme that lies at the heart of Marx's Capital.